Hello everybody, I just did a Godzilla review a couple days ago, and now to balance things out, I'm doing a Jane Eyre video. Today's Jane Eyre adaptation comparison focuses on the scene commonly referred to as the second conversation, but also known as the one where Rochester asks Jane if she thinks he's handsome, and she says no, and we all laugh. It's a few days after their first conversation, and Rochester is in a talkative mood. Partly because he's been drinking. He needs someone to talk to, and because Jane is the only suitable companion around, he sends for her. But really, he wants to draw out more of that unique personality of hers that he's caught glimpses of twice already. The conversation, while a little stiff at first, gradually loosens up as these two find an equal footing. This is a mentally stimulating discussion, and there are signs, even at this early stage, of how attuned they are to each other. They may be separated by age and experience, but they understand each other, although Jane does get a little lost amid Rochester's strange string of metaphors. Thematically, this scene sets up Rochester's redemptive arc when the dialogue takes a darker turn. The hints about Rochester's past, his degradation and remorse, and his question to Jane of whether she believes there is any hope for his reformation is probably the most important aspect of the scene. Now, for the purpose of doing this scene comparison, I again tried out the spreadsheet technique, and it sort of worked. Here's a peek at it. It's a mess. A lot of the adaptations only got half credit for some things, and I couldn't decide if I should check the box or not, so the whole thing is pretty inconsistent. Alright, let's talk about the adaptations, starting with 1934, or maybe not. 1934 doesn't actually have this scene. Instead, there's a scene where Adele gets stuck in a tree, Jane goes up after her, and Rochester has to help them both down, and then Adele hints that she'd like it if Rochester married Jane. It's all pretty silly. So we're really starting with the 1944 version, in which Rochester passes Jane and Adele on his return from a blustery walk, and then doubles back to command her to accompany him down the stairs. There, in a mostly empty room, he plunks a chair down beside his, ordering her not to move it away, and commands her to talk.
Sit down, Miss Eyre. No, go on further back. Down just here, I placed it. Forward a little. Still too far back. I can't see you without disturbing my position in this comfortable chair, which I have no mind to do.
Rochester is very pushy and arrogant here, but I find it more amusing than insulting, maybe because I'm biased and I always enjoy this little tug-of-war with the chair. With respect to dialogue, I'm pretty satisfied with how closely this version sticks to the book. It's not perfect, but it strikes the right points for me, and like I've said before, I enjoy Orson Welles even if he's not my ideal Rochester. I also like Jane's matter-of-fact response to the handsome question, which is how I prefer it to be. My only complaint, which I think I remember mentioning in my review of this movie ages ago, is that a lot of Wells's lines in this scene sound dubbed, as if there was a mic or audio problem and he had to redo his dialogue. It always throws me off. Also, the scene ends so much more romantically than originally written.
Hope you'll be happy at Thornfield.
I hope so, sir. I think so.
I'm glad.
The only thing I remembered about this scene in the 1970 version from when I watched it for the first time a few years ago was that Rochester loses his temper and smashes his wine glass. It was really startling and I did not like it at all. This time around, well, I still don't like it, but I can kind of understand the reason for the outburst. He's already testy, and alcohol may be a contributing factor, and he's getting annoyed with Jane's prim silence. I think he keeps provoking her condemnation, but she never says anything, not even when he tells her of Adele's illegitimacy. Note, this scene kind of combines the second and third conversations into one. He expects Jane to quit on the spot, so when she says instead that Adele isn't answerable for her mother's faults, I think all that wholesome goodness just drives him crazy and he loses it.
Confound it, have you none of your own?
The consequence of them writing that in is that I come away feeling like Jane and Rochester are no closer at the end of this scene than they were at the beginning. Also, I find it hard to forget a crazy outburst of temper like that. It's hard to walk it back. I do like their handling of the handsome question. Like Fontaine, York is matter-of-fact. She pauses briefly before she answers, so it's not quite a knee-jerk reaction like it was in the book, and then she says very calmly,
No, sir.
On my word, you are blunt.
The 1973 adaptation of this scene runs over 15 minutes and is by far the longest version, but at least there's a lot of furniture in the room, and the actors can move around now and then to switch things up. Attention was also given to staging. Notice how in the latter part, during Rochester's more intimate revelation of his degeneracy, they face each other on back-to-back sofas, a more relaxed position that brings them closer together and on a level plane. Cusack and Jaston are both cognizant of the underlying humor of many of Bronte's lines and play it up accordingly. That's one of the things I love about this version. It's a little lighter, thanks especially to Jaston's winsome way of saying and doing just about everything. Case in point, one of my favorite parts here is the business over the chair. While Rochester's got his back turned, Jane scoots her chair away from his a few inches. He comes back and sits down, and at first you're thinking, good thing she moved her chair, or else this would have been awkward. But then, without even seeming to look, he comments on it and insists she draw the chair forward again. The best part of the whole thing is that he seems to know that he's being difficult, and he does it anyway. He doesn't care. He's doing it just to push her buttons. I don't know. I love it. It's hilarious. The 1983 version is the second longest, but it's only about 10 minutes thanks to some minor alterations that condense the dialogue and give it a nice natural flow. In this one, I really like how about halfway through you can feel the temperature in the room change. This occurs following my favorite part of the discussion, the whole salary, paid subordinate, mentally shake hands with you section. Their features soften, there are some smiles, and the ice is broken.
Well then, on that mercenary ground, will you agree to let me hector you a little?
No, sir. Not on that ground. But on the grounds that you did forget it, and that you care whether or not a dependent is comfortable in his dependency.
I like how Dalton takes his time with his lines. He pauses in between sentences and everything. It feels natural, even though he's got that fancy theatrical way of saying things that no one uses anymore. You know, rolling his R's and such. They did cut out a few of the stranger things Rochester says. I love the guy, but you know he says some bizarre stuff. No wonder Jane gets confused. With the 1996 adaptation, the conversation numbering gets a little complicated because their first conversation was split up into two parts. This scene is brought outside. Jane and Adele are sketching, and Adele asks Jane to draw Rochester so she'll have his likeness when he goes away. Then Rochester unexpectedly joins them. The fact that this is outside and Adele is present has probably bothered me in the past. No, we're supposed to be inside by the fire! But either I've become more open to change, or watching all these fireside scenes one after another is wearing me down, but I don't mind this. The natural setting is appealing. The business with the sketch, Rochester frowning at himself and crumpling it up, says as much as a lengthy speech would, and they manage to convey a lot of sentiment in a matter of a couple minutes, which is all the time they have to spare in a feature-length movie. Again, I'm struck by how gorgeous this movie looks and sounds, and the actors are growing on me too. Rochester seems less old and Jane less frigid than I used to think. I must be maturing or something. I'm actually praising 1996, a version I used to dislike. Yes, there's stuff missing from this scene, but what they do have serves the desired purpose, and I'm satisfied with that.
Think there's any hope for me?
Hope for what, sir?
My being transformed from India rubber back to flesh and blood? Come, pilot.
The 1997 version of this scene is probably longer than the 96 one, but it feels shorter. Perhaps because it doesn't go as deep. There isn't as much substance. The dialogue is basically whittled down to an argument about handsomeness and attraction, and whether or not it's okay for Rochester to order Jane around. Now, those two sections are my favorite parts of the conversation, I think, so that's nice, and Kieran Hines is especially humorous here. but there's a lot missing, namely the less amusing, more intellectual, emotional stuff. The focus here is less on revealing more about Rochester's character, the good and the bad, and more on showing how he's attracted to her, and she's sort of attracted to him, but also kind of still disliking him. A couple other things worth mentioning. Well, no, this is hardly worth mentioning. It's just funny when Rochester gets up to warm his backside at the fire. It's just so obvious that that's what he's doing, and it's comical. It's also interesting that he calls her Jane. I usually think of that as not happening until the fire scene.
Do as you please, sir.
That is a very irritating reply, Jane.
Oh, and with the handsome question, Jane's no sir comes out very deliberate. She sounds like she really means it, and given her overall attitude toward him, I feel like she's trying to give him a set down. Do people still say that in 2018? Trying to give him a set down? I feel like they don't, but I'm so immersed in Bronte's dialogue right now that I'm forgetting how to talk like a normal 21st century person. This happens to me sometimes. By far, the 2006 version of this scene is the funniest.
I pay you a salary, do I? Well, of course I do. Well, then I should have my money's worth then. Oh. I can see there's another problem. Out with it.
You haven't actually paid me anything yet, sir.
Oh! Mercenary girl! Fetch me my keys now. You want my money in your hand before you will amuse me.
No, sir.
Huh?
Remember how I said that 83 had a nice natural flow? This one has the same advantage, though the execution is very different, partly because it's made slightly more modern, though not to the point of insulting the purist audience, and partly because quite a lot of the altered dialogue encourages the characters to be more informal and responsive to each other. And bearing in mind what I just said about Rochester in 97 calling her Jane, Rochester calls her Jane 3 times here. Shocking. Humorous Rochester is my favorite Rochester, and Toby Stephens really brings that side out. He's just so darn likable and appealing.
Do you think me handsome, Jane?
No, sir.
And okay, I've just got to pause right here and talk about this before the video ends while we're on the subject of the second conversation. In just about every iteration of Jane Eyre, the "do you think me handsome, no sir" exchange gets a laugh. It's an awkward, embarrassing question, he asks it point blank, and Jane's response is comically blunt. But it's really funny when the person playing Rochester is someone we definitely consider hot or good-looking, so when Jane says no, we snort in disbelief. But the question asked is, do you think me handsome? And while certainly not ugly, I'm not sure if any of these actors qualify as conventionally handsome, especially in Bronte's time. You might feel that Toby Stephens or Timothy Dalton or Michael Fassbender or any of the others is smokin' hot. But that's a subjective thing, whereas conventional handsomeness, what they're talking about here, I perceive as more of a set ideal of perfection. And you've got to remember that handsome or beautiful is not the same thing as attractive, at least not according to my understanding. You can find someone attractive who does not have perfect physical features. That's something Bronte's story is striving to show. Rochester is ugly. Jane is plain. But they find each other incredibly attractive. Anyway, I needed to cover that topic. I should probably throw out there that this version also moved some dialogue around. The cadeau and the boite were kind of melded together, and Rochester's metaphorical depiction of Jane as a caged bird is moved to a later scene that they added, I think maybe because they wanted to give Jane and Rochester more scenes together, which I'm okay with. Lastly, the 2011 version starts with Rochester moodily tinkering on the piano as the ladies enter for tea. I think this is the only version in which Rochester is still noticeably limping, which implies that this scene occurs the following evening, not several days later as in the book. Fassbender's Rochester is as sarcastic here as he was in the previous scene, so there isn't really much of an unexpected change of temperament, which I find kind of disappointing. It is noteworthy, though, that toward the end of the conversation, his guard has dropped a little, and he gets a desperate, tragic look in his eyes. I don't know, this version of the scene doesn't grab me. It's so dark and quiet and static and so similar visually to the previous conversation. It has a few of my favorite lines, but only goes halfway with some of them, and I don't like that they change "you look puzzled" to
"You're blushing, Miss Eyre. And though you're not pretty any more than I am handsome, I must say it becomes you."
I suppose they did that because they're aiming for a sexual awakening thing, but eh. They do, however, do a good job including Rochester's perceptive Jane as caged bird metaphor. In fact, I think Fassbender does a better job with these lines than previous actors. Perhaps it helps that they streamlined it a bit and took out some of the confusing, flowery dialogue that leads up to it. So, yet again, I find it difficult to pick a favorite. I guess 1983 is in the lead, battling for the #1 spot with 2006, followed by 1973. There seems to be a pattern developing here. After that, it's kind of a free-for-all. I like 96, I like 44, but also 2011 and 1970 had some good moments. So, yeah, this is how it's gonna go every time. I was contemplating skipping the third conversation and just going straight to the fire scene, but I just can't. My conscience won't let me do something so outrageous, especially since I've already told you all how important these conversations are. I'd love to know what you think of this scene and the different versions of it, which lines you prefer, which interpretations you prefer, so go ahead and share your thoughts down below. I look forward to reading them as always, and hopefully I'll get the next one done before too long. Thanks for watching!